tackling the issue of religious liberty because it's at stake, friends. It is at stake. And Dr. Jeffress, you go ahead with your thoughts on this because I played that soundbite of Dobson. You had talked to him that day, and go ahead, share what's on your heart.
Well, the big question I know a lot of Christians have is, okay, so what? If gays want to marry, how does that affect me? And I'll mention just two ways. Mm-hmm. First of all, Dr. Dobson talked about the impact this has on children and therefore the impact on society. Look, we already know how this story ends.
We do.
The Hoover Institute actually did a study of what happened in Scandinavian countries that legalized same-sex marriage. And by the way, as Justice Kennedy pointed out in the oral argument, this whole idea of same-sex marriage is a recent phenomenon. It hasn't been with us for thousands or hundreds of years or even decades. The first same-sex marriage was at the beginning of the 21st century. So this is a new phenomenon. And yet, in Scandinavian countries that have legalized same-sex marriage, they found that as a result, not that many gay couples actually ended up getting married. What they found was the number of heterosexuals marrying decreased precipitously. And the reason is clear. If marriage is anything you want it to be, 2 men, 2 women, 3 men, and a woman, if it's whatever you construct it to be, why bother to get married at all? I don't think it's any coincidence that last year the U.S. had its lowest marriage rate in 93 years. And so what you have is you have children being born into single-parent households. That's creating all kind of societal discord. And whenever you say that 2 men can rear a child just as effectively as a man and a woman, what you're really saying is a child doesn't need one or the other of its biological parents. And in my book, Twilight's Last Gleaming, I quote Sarah McClanahan, a sociologist from Princeton University, who said, if we were trying to design the ideal environment in which to rear a child, it would be one in which the child was connected to both of its biological parents. Well, gee, that kind of sounds like a family to me, doesn't it, Jude?
It does.
So I think there are going to be severe sociological consequences, but I think what every Christian listening to right now needs to understand is the effect on religious liberty this is going to have. You know, Friday night, when this decision came out, that Friday night, I was debating the pastor of the largest gay church in America. And he was talking about how we need to be tolerant and kind of giving me a lecture on tolerance. And so I said, well, let me ask you how tolerant you are. Do you think those 2 bakers in Oregon who had to lose their business because they wouldn't bake a cake for a lesbian wedding, do you think they should have their business closed because of that? And Jan, he wouldn't answer my question. I asked him 3 times. He wouldn't answer the question because, in fact, he thought that couple should have their business shut down. And this is where this is going. I mean, our listeners need to understand something. In this Supreme Court decision, Justice Kennedy kind of, threw an olive branch at Christians and said, well, churches still have the right to advocate their position. But as Justice Roberts noted, he said nothing about the right of individual Christians to freely exercise their religion. And that's what the First Amendment is all about. The First Amendment doesn't talk about the freedom of worship, that is, the right to worship God in your church, synagogue, or home. It talks about the guarantee of the free exercise of religion. Our faith is meant to be more than something we do in church. We exercise our faith in every part of our life. And as Chief Justice Roberts noted, Kennedy was silent about that, and the silence was ominous. And I think this is what you're going to see. I hear this argument till I want to throw up, Jan. People say, and they've said to me on television, well, nobody's going to put a gun to your head and make you marry a gay couple. Nobody's arguing that. Nobody's going to put a gun to my head and make me do that. But what government can do is impose sanctions against Christian businesses, individuals, and eventually churches that will deny this new civil right. And by enshrining gay marriage as a civil right, anybody who opposes same-sex marriage is going to be seen guilty of opposing the civil right. The government cannot and will not allow that to happen.
As Dr. Dobson said, and you are essentially saying the same thing, real persecution is coming. And he suggested jail could be awaiting some of us. Everything, ministries, churches, businesses, schools, charities, my ministry are going to be affected. Posting a story on a website, if I post headlines here on my website, it's going to probably be monitored. Tax-exempt status is definitely going to be at stake. This is a new day.
It is. And look, I have been ridiculed on every liberal blog out there for saying on Hannity a few weeks ago that Christians are being marginalized today in our society just as the Jews were in the pre-Holocaust days in Germany. You know, Jan, you know this from history.
Yes.
The Nazis didn't take the Jews to the crematorium immediately. The Germans wouldn't have allowed for that. Instead, the Nazis began a program of making the Jews objects of contempt and ridicule, first of all, and then once they succeeded and marginalized them, they were able to take away their ultimate rights. Well, I've been ridiculed for saying that Christians were like that. I talked to a couple last week in Maine, a pastor and his wife. They came up to me weeping. They said their little church in Maine had taken a position against same-sex marriage, and the church was painted with a swastika for doing so. Now, how is that for tolerance? Anybody who doesn't believe Christians are being marginalized right now, they have their head in the sand.